Welcome to Blackman Folktales. Kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also like and share. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell, as this means the whole world to us. Amelia Locke's earliest memories were not of lullabies or warm embraces but of silence so heavy it seemed to swallow the very air around her. She had grown up in a small house on the edge of the city, its walls thin enough to let in the noise of life outside, yet inside it was always hollow as if joy had been banished at the door. Her father had vanished when she was still too young to form a memory of his face, leaving behind nothing but a cracked photograph tucked into a drawer and questions no one would answer. Her mother, though present in the physical sense, was absent in every way that mattered. Words between them were scarce, reduced to commands or sighs, and when Amelia sought comfort, she was met with eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her. At school things were no kinder. Children noticed her quietness and turned it into a weapon, whispering behind her back, mocking her hand-me-down clothes, and giving her nicknames that stuck to her like cruel scars. The classroom became another battlefield where she was outnumbered and unarmed, and soon Amelia learned that blending into the background was the only way to survive. Nights were her loneliest hours. She would press her face into her pillow to muffle her sobs so the neighbors wouldn't hear, her small body shaking under the weight of emotions she was too young to name. In those moments, her journal became her only friend, a secret book where she poured her heart in crooked handwriting, asking questions no one would answer and sketching dreams she doubted would ever come true. Though she was only a child, Amelia already carried the heavy lesson that love was not promised, that family did not always mean safety, and that silence could be more painful than any shouted word. As Amelia grew into adolescence, the silence that once suffocated her childhood turned into a gnawing emptiness that followed her like a shadow she couldn't shake. She became accustomed to being overlooked. Teachers forgot to call her name, classmates left her out of games and projects, and when she walked through hallways she often felt like a ghost passing through walls. Yet the absence of acknowledgement was almost easier than the sting of attention. On the rare occasions when eyes did fall on her, they were filled with mockery or pity, both of which cut her deeply. She began to believe she was invisible, not just to her peers but to the entire world. Her mother's detachment worsened with time, and what little communication they had dwindled further until their house felt more like a waiting room for strangers than a home. Amelia often wondered if she even mattered at all, if her existence registered to anyone beyond the fact that she occupied space. And with that thought came dangerous nights, the kind where despair whispered seductively, asking her to step into the dark and let go of the pain. More than once, she found herself standing at her bedroom window, staring at the city lights in the distance, wondering what it would feel like to stop existing. She never told anyone about those moments, but they etched themselves into her bones, making her fragile in ways others couldn't see. Her journal became darker too, filled with words like empty, forgotten, and why. Yet in between those bleak entries there were faint sparks. A poem about a bird breaking free from its cage, a sketch of a girl standing at the edge of a cliff but looking at the stars. These glimpses were tiny rebellions against despair, hints of a resilience that Amelia herself didn't recognize. It was as though even in her darkest hours, some small part of her refused to let the silence claim her entirely. By the time Amelia reached her late teens, her loneliness had evolved into a kind of armor, cold, impenetrable, and misunderstood. To the outside world, she appeared detached, the kind of girl who kept to herself, uninterested in friendships or laughter. But behind that mask was a heart desperate for connection, terrified that opening up would only invite more pain. She had learned to walk through life in carefully measured steps, speaking when spoken to, smiling politely without letting it reach her eyes, and pretending she was fine when inside she was unraveling. Her journal had become her most loyal confidant, thick with years of secrets, confessions, and sketches of the life she wished she could live. Yet despite her isolation, there was something forming inside Amelia, though she could not see it yet. Every insult she endured, every night she spent alone, every unanswered cry for help was shaping her into someone stronger than she realized. Pain, though merciless, was also a teacher. It taught her how to listen, not just with her ears but with her soul. It gave her the ability to notice what others missed, to see behind the smiles of people around her, to sense the heaviness hidden in their eyes. While the world dismissed her as invisible, Amelia was quietly developing a gift that would one day set her apart. But in those years she did not see it as power. She saw only the weight of silence pressing on her chest, convincing her she was too small, too unwanted, too broken to matter. Little did she know that the very scars she carried, the very wounds that threatened to consume her, were planting seeds of strength that would one day bloom into something extraordinary. The girl who believed she had no place in the world was slowly becoming the woman who would change it, not in spite of her pain but because of it. Adulthood did not arrive in Amelia's life with freedom or joy. It came with the heavy cloak of responsibility and the lingering sting of the past. By the time she turned 20, she had built her life around invisibility, moving quietly between jobs that paid little and apartments that felt more like borrowed spaces than homes. Yet despite her efforts to blend in, Amelia's scars had left her with something she could neither suppress nor deny, an uncanny ability to see through others. Where most people noticed only the surface, Amelia noticed what was hidden. The way a cashier's smile quivered at the corners, the way a coworker's eyes seemed dull even as she laughed, the way strangers shifted their weight when burdened by something they would never say aloud. At first, Amelia saw this ability as a curse, a painful reminder of how broken she was, for every glance into someone else's sorrow dragged her back into her own. But as time went on, she realized this was not just sensitivity, it was survival turned into a strange gift. Her own loneliness had taught her to recognize it in others, and her journal had become filled with reflections not just about herself but about the quiet grief of the world around her. Though she rarely spoke it aloud, Amelia began to sense a deeper truth, that maybe her scars weren't meant to keep her silent, but to help her listen to the cries no one else heard. The turning point came unexpectedly on a subway ride home from another long shift. The train car was half empty, filled with the usual mixture of tired faces and restless commuters, when Amelia's eyes fell on a man sitting across from her. He was middle-aged, dressed neatly, but his entire posture was bent beneath an invisible weight. His hands shook slightly as he clutched a bag, and his eyes were red, swollen from tears he was clearly trying to hide. Nobody else noticed him. They were lost in their phones, their music, their impatience to get home. But Amelia saw him, the way his pain clung to him like a second skin, the way his breathing was shallow as though he was fighting against something that wanted to break him. She hesitated, unsure of what to do, until her fingers brushed against her journal in her bag. 4 years she had poured her despair and fragile hopes into those pages, never thinking anyone else would read them. But in that moment she tore out a page and with trembling hands, wrote a sentence she had once written to herself in her darkest hour: "You are more than your pain. I know because I was nothing once too and I am still here." She slid the paper across the seat when the man wasn't looking, then quickly turned away. When he finally noticed it, his eyes widened, filling with tears that were different this time, not just of grief but of recognition. He looked around, searching for the source, and when his gaze landed on Amelia, he didn't speak. He simply gave the faintest nod as if to say thank you. For the first time in her life, Amelia felt her pain had reached beyond her. It had become something powerful, something that mattered. That subway encounter haunted Amelia for weeks, not as a wound but as a revelation. If her words, born of scars and silence, could lift a stranger for even a moment, then perhaps her suffering was not wasted. Slowly she began testing this idea in small ways. She would leave anonymous notes in library books, write encouraging words on scraps of paper and slip them into the pockets of jackets at thrift stores, or offer a kind sentence to someone who looked like the world had forgotten them. Each time she felt a strange mixture of fear and freedom, as though she was stepping into a role she never asked for but had been preparing for her entire life. And then came the day when someone at her workplace, a girl who had always kept to herself, broke down in tears in the bathroom. Amelia sat beside her, hesitant but compelled, and shared just a fraction of her own story, not the details, but the feeling of being invisible, unwanted, and drowning in silence. The girl listened wide-eyed and then whispered, "You make me feel less alone." That sentence clung to Amelia like sunlight breaking through clouds. She began to see that her pain wasn't meant to chain her, it was meant to connect her. Every scar she had carried in shame was becoming her bridge to others. By the time she was invited, through a friend of a friend, to share her story at a small community gathering, Amelia knew she was standing at the edge of something larger. She was terrified, yes, but she also felt the stirrings of destiny, that her scars were no longer just hers, they were speaking and the world was listening. The night of her first public talk, Amelia could hardly breathe. She stood backstage in a modest auditorium, clutching her journal against her chest as though it were armor. Rows of chairs stretched before her, filled with faces she didn't know, waiting for a story she wasn't sure she had the strength to tell. Her hands shook so violently she could barely hold her notes, and her chest ached with the familiar fear of being exposed. She had spent years avoiding attention, hiding behind silence, and now she was about to step into a spotlight brighter than anything she had ever faced. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to retreat into the safety of shadows. But then she remembered the man on the subway, the coworker in the bathroom, the strangers who had needed words she once thought were worthless. This was not about her anymore, it was about them. Taking a shaky breath, Amelia walked onto the stage, the lights blinding her, the silence deafening. When she spoke her first words, her voice trembled, breaking on the edges of sentences. Yet instead of pity she saw the audience leaning in, their eyes soft, their attention unbroken. The more she spoke, the steadier her voice became, and with every word she released she felt the chains of her past fall away. She told them about loneliness, about silence, about the nights when she thought she would not make it to morning. But she also told them about survival, about the sparks of hope hidden even in despair, and about how her scars had become her compass. By the time she finished there were tears in the room, not just hers but theirs too. That first talk led to others. Invitations began to trickle in, schools, shelters, community centers, and eventually larger conferences. Amelia never thought of herself as a speaker, She was simply someone who told the truth about pain, and that truth resonated with people more than polished words ever could. She began building a platform not out of ambition but out of necessity. People needed to hear that they were not defined by their wounds, that brokenness did not make them unworthy, and that silence could be broken by even the faintest whisper of courage. With each speech, Amelia shed another layer of the invisibility she had carried her entire life. She no longer hid behind the pages of her journal, she read from them boldly, her once private words now shared with thousands. What surprised her most was how her story transformed those around her. People who had been silent for years began writing to her, approaching her after talks, confessing their own struggles with pain, depression, abandonment, and fear. They told her that her story had given them permission to speak, to heal, to believe they were not alone. Amelia realized then that her pain was no longer just her own, it had become a collective story, one that belonged to everyone who had ever felt invisible and unworthy. Years later, Amelia stood before an audience of thousands in a grand hall, the stage lit with brilliance, cameras rolling, her words carried across the globe through live streams and broadcasts. Yet in her heart, she still felt like the girl in her bedroom, scribbling in a journal, desperate to be seen. She smiled faintly at the irony, how the very pain that once convinced her she was nothing had elevated her into a beacon for others. She lifted her head, looked out at the sea of faces, and spoke with a strength that shook the walls. Your pain is not your ending. It is your fire. It is the mark of your survival. Do not curse your scars, they are proof that you are still here. My pain once silenced me, convinced me I was invisible. But today I stand before you not as someone unbroken but as someone rebuilt. My pain became my greatest power. And so can yours. The room erupted, not with applause alone, but with the raw energy of hearts being lifted, of chains breaking, of hope ignited. And as Amelia stepped down from the stage, she finally understood. She had not risen in spite of her suffering. She had risen because of it. Her pain, the weight that once threatened to destroy her, had become the voice that would echo long after she was gone. Thank you for watching. Kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos as this means a lot to us.